Awesome. So we can get things started, I guess. Well, firstly, thank you again, Chandra, for taking the time today. If you want to just maybe start the session off by introducing yourself, telling us, who you are, what you do, and maybe just uh, some of the things that you're passionate about, I feel like that'd be a fun start to the session.
Sure. So hi everyone, I'm Chandra Sahu. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am currently a shopping strategy and operations manager at Pinterest. I started there mid-June along with the team of the Yes, which was a startup that Pinterest acquired. So I was at the Yes from November 2021 until June and then joined Pinterest. And prior to the Yes, I was at Goldman Sachs in investment banking in the technology group and then also in the consumer retail group. So I've generally touched a lot of stuff consumer and internet and tech, and I've done banking and super small startup and then now big tech. So quite a variety of roles. And I am based in New York City, have been since graduation from University of Michigan in 2019. And I love to sing and I am learning how to play guitar. So that is where I'm spending my free time these days.
That's amazing. I feel like even while I was kind of like kind of preparing for the session, like one thing that really stood out is I feel like a lot of people have those three things that you did as like three separate exit opportunities when they think about like what they want to do post college. And even a lot of marketing students I know are always very interested, like, finance or big tech or startups. And I think it's really cool that you've done all three. So would love to just hear your insights on maybe what you liked in those three different areas, maybe what you disliked, and kind of how they were connected in terms of like, well, I guess Pinterest and the Yes was like a bit more of like a separate thing, but just like what you liked and what you didn't like from finance, startup, and maybe big tech.
Yeah, sure. Pardon me if it gets long-winded in advance, but and actually all three ended up being connected in weird ways. So I started at Goldman out of undergrad because I knew that I wanted to start my career somewhere where I was going to see a lot horizontally. So I loved consumer products, loved consumer stories, thought attended the marketing conference as a student and thought about going that route, but instead, I focused on understanding kind of like the big finance part of that for companies that had made it and are big and public, because I wanted to understand how executives of those companies think about their businesses and their customers. So I started in banking. I knew that that was going to come with sacrifices if anybody has heard about banking or the compromises that come with it. And I think the same is true in a lot of like intense starter industries and roles. But for me, it felt like something that I was willing to sacrifice in terms of the upside of exit opportunities and learning experience. And I ended up leaving banking because I had known when I went into it that I wasn't necessarily interested in it as a lifelong path. The intensity of the lack of work-life balance is something that was really not a fit for me longer than like 2 years. And so I got promoted to associate and left and actually didn't have a role, like didn't know what I was going to do, wanted to completely start over, knew that I wanted something more operational and smaller team, etc. Um, I ended up coming to the Yes because a friend of mine who had worked in Goldman, who had actually managed me on a team, was in that role. And he knew that he was going to be leaving in about a month. And so he was like, if you're interested, I'd prepare now. And I think the biggest thing about that leap is that technically I was underqualified for the role. Like if the role had been listed on LinkedIn, it would have said, 7, 8 years experience, whatever. And so the biggest learning that I had getting from Goldman to that, and even like finding myself in between and figuring out what I wanted my next role to be, was just having to build this unequivocal belief in myself that like I can do it, I can convince them, and even when I get there, I can learn. Especially in a startup environment where I knew it's really like you have more opportunity to prove your merit versus the experience folks would think that you would need. And so I got the job somehow. Thank whoever needs to be thanked. And that was an entirely different experience. Like such a smaller team, working with senior folks all the time, but really still pretty in the weeds. So like everything across op operationalizing our business and understanding how to grow it, understanding our customer, trying to understand their customer behaviors month to month. And we were in a really high growth environment because it was so early stage. So it was like constantly figuring out what was working and what wasn't and who we wanted to be for folks. So that was really interesting. And then in terms of the acquisition by Pinterest, everyone had the opportunity to stay on or to exit and look for other opportunities. But for me to see the arc on all ends, from like an advisor of big companies to working at a small company to then being in something that's very new in an established company, was an interesting angle for me. So I think post acquisition, like everyone's still figuring everything out, but there's a lot of opportunity to pick what in the field you want ownership over. And I've liked that.
Wow. I mean, that's insane. Like even hearing you say that this was a role that was meant or probably have been listed for like 7 to 8 years on LinkedIn, and then like getting it with like 2 years of experience is like so freaking cool. And I guess like on that vein, right, for and this will be like a we'll go more into like advice and other things, but I think it just being relevant here, like what like how would you say for like students that might feel, and I feel like this is especially true a lot of times for like queer folks and even queer students, when you feel underqualified or you're like, like, am I going to be enough or feel enough for a specific role? Like, how do you mentally kind of take that leap and say, no, I can actually do this? Like, is there tangible things that you did, or was it just, you know, sufficient amount of Instagram posts that are self-help? Like, like what did you do to really feel uh get yourself to that place where you're like, no, I am qualified to be able to do this?
Yeah, so that was really hard and like a significant part of the time that I had between employment.
Mm,
When I left Goldman, I knew that I had made the right decision for me, and I was really grateful to myself that some part of me must have believed enough that I will find another job, that I took that leap of faith. But even doing it was like really, really scary, right? I'm like, was I not cut out for it? I wasn't ever good enough. Maybe like, what am I really meant to do? How do I get back to myself after 2 years of working in something so intense? And I literally could not touch my resume for like 3 weeks
well,
after I quit. Like, I kept trying to sit down and update it, and I would be overcome with anxiety every time.
oh my,
And I was in this weird middle ground where I was like, I knew that on some end I was capable and I was going to find a job and whatever. But also in my immediate world and future, like I felt paralyzed by the previous experiences and by the uncertainty of the future. And there were a few things that I think got me in a position to interview for the yes. One was the champion that I had in my friend, who led me to the job. So he was just the kind of person who was like positive vibes, like you wouldn't have expected to find him in banking. He's like very woosah, yeah, man, like cheers. And he'd always been somebody who's a bit of a lighthouse in that world for me. And so building that relationship over the time that we were at Goldman and then after he left was important in providing the foundation to even leap and for him to know that I was capable too.
right.
Because I don't think I would have gotten the job without an advocate who knew of my abilities.
Mm,
Um, that was part of it. And but then a big one was really just like getting myself to break down the steps that were required and try and make them more manageable for myself and really try and understand, look, I know if they're asking 7 to 8 years experience, I'm not going to have it in XYZ area that they think they need it. But what I
mm,
do have is this that complements their business. I have this experience in consumer and tech companies. I have this experience leading teams and organizations in O for You.
well,
I have kind of done a product role in my roles in O for You. And so I was like, how can I spin this? Because I know this is my job. Like, I know this is my job, but how do I get there? And that was like a whole nother like month and a half of prep and actually a lot of, so I would start with like reading prep, like research and just putting things in bullets and feeling like I was familiar with information. And then
mm,
a lot of my time working up to the interview was spent talking to myself. I would like walk around New York and make a voice recording speaking out loud about my opinions on the business, my opinions on the industry, my opinions on the value I could add. And then I would listen back to those and be like, what feels really true and resonant here? What feels like I'm grasping at straws? How do I fine tune this so that when I come into these interviews, I'm having an informed conversation as a stakeholder that they want at the table versus somebody who is like nervous about the question they're going to ask me next.
Wow. So it's definitely having faith in yourself, but it's also like freaking practicing and
Yeah.
like putting in
Yeah.
that time. Makes a lot of sense. Wow. And I guess like even on that, right? Like with where you started, like with leaving Goldman, right? I would love to hear you like talk more about that in the sense of like how was that experience? Was it mostly just like, it's a work-life balance that pushed you to leave? Were there other things? And yeah, just would love to hear more about that time there. And I guess maybe to finish it off, like, do you think it was worth it to start there?
Yeah. I think this is a really important conversation to have, and I will be super candid about it as I always am with my O4U family. I got my opportunity at Goldman partially through the O4U Business Conference and recruiters that I'd met there, and I started my career at Goldman with great relationships and sponsors from my internships. And I knew that it was going to be a hard path, but that there were particular things that I wanted to learn or have an ability to speak to in
Mm,
order to ultimately be a founder of my own and understand what they have to deal with at that executive level, et cetera. I will say that when I got into the job, um, there's nothing really that can prepare you for like what working in banking really is.
wow.
No internship, like no, like you just have no idea until you're in it. Everything is mission critical all the time, and the hours are insane. And I think the biggest thing that affected me in working in banking was that you are robbed of a lot of your agency.
Mm,
And because your agency so much like lies in your time. And I think that there are people who can find pockets of agency and set boundaries and you know, and therefore it can still be something that's sustainable and interesting and engaging for them and rewarding also monetarily, frankly. For me and the kind of person I am, I was missing a lot of the things that I used to have in college that could feed me creatively and personally so that I could do these things in business. Um, so frankly, I got to a year in banking and I felt like I'd I'd worked a lot, I'd learned a lot, but I hadn't learned some particular things that I'd wanted to in terms of like live deal experience or exposure to different verticals. So I continued to advocate for myself and I ended up moving groups from consumer retail to TMT, technology, media, and telecom. And
right.
in TMT, I was still pretty like consumer internet focused. And so that was really a point in my analyst years where I was getting a ton more exposure and work and deal work. And it was a lot more of it was what I knew I needed to learn, but the
Mm,
amount of time that I could manage the expectations and workload of that group was finite.
yeah.
And I got promoted to associate in June or July of last year. And the responsibilities started shifting a bit. And I just had this moment of like, I've known that there were things I wanted to learn here, but I've also known there was always going to be an endpoint. I'm now stepping into increased responsibility and different skill sets. Is this how I want to spend my time? And really, one of the other things that a mentor said to me was like, if you know you want to leave, sometimes it's better to leave now when you have that inkling versus down the road if you've seeded negative feelings around it even more, if you're not going to have a great way to communicate it. Um, the actual decision was kind of spontaneous. Like it was something I'd marinated on long enough that when it came and my gut said go, my head had to listen. So it wasn't like it was entirely out of the blue, but the timing of it was like pretty spontaneous. I had a moment in a day, it was actually several days of just my body and my brain being like, Chandra, we're done here. Like we're done. We got what we came for, and you can't do this anymore. And I had to just listen to that. And I had fought that voice for so long, being like, no, there's a little bit more value I'm going to get out of this experience. There's this thing I want to do and that. But I hit a point where I really had checked off, I think, the majority of things I'd want to accomplish. And so I was no longer doing any of it for myself. And at that point, after having offered so much of myself, I like I couldn't do that. Do I
Oh,
think it was worth it? Yes. Like, I am in such a uniquely privileged position in terms of some of the opportunities I've gotten in my career and
wow.
career acceleration and like the things I've seen, the languages I understand, how to speak in different circles. So I'm really immensely grateful for the opportunity, but it is one that was a very careful and measured decision. And one that I think, whether it's banking or like an intense agency or any sort of intense experience, you have to keep checking in with yourself and
Hmm.
on your why you're doing it and how long you want to do it for and what your measures of success are personally besides the firm's measures.
Oh, that was amazing, Chandra. So like I feel like the students are gonna get so much value out of that. Because like what I'm hearing from you is that like yes, there people go down these paths because everyone does it a lot of times, but I think having your own personal checklist of like this is what I want to get out of it, like this is how this is gonna fit into like the story I'm carving for myself, and like having that checklist while you're at the job and seeing if like am I learning the things that I'm getting like that I wanted to, like am I actually moving forward in the ways that I want to instead of just like being there for the sake of being there is super important. And I really like how you're able to like, or like, I think it's amazing how you're able to like take agency within your role. You're like, no, this team doesn't work. Let me go to another team where I can learn these things. Okay, great. I learned these things. Did I learn what I needed to? Yeah, I think I did. Time to check the fuck out or check out. Like, like, I think that's amazing. And, uh, and now that you did that, right? Like, at least post banking and you realized the skill set that you wanted, was that how you similarly approached your new role in terms of like, did you have a new skill set or like a checklist that you're like, these are the things I want to learn to be where I am now? Or like, do you have that even at Pinterest now? Or is it more like a bit more abstract now, as maybe as opposed to maybe being like concrete things that might have guided you to banking and the sort of things you could get out of that role?
Yeah, I think it's a bit more abstract. I think particularly being at Pinterest and having that, sorry, excuse me, role be in flux after an acquisition leaves a lot more room to redefine, okay, what is it I'm trying to do and do I have the um champions and the space to access that here. But when I joined the yes, some of my priorities were like I'd say I approach things with like, what's the large scale learning I want? So eventually down the line, I'd love to found a business. I want it to be a great place to work and I want it to be a great product.
Wow.
And so I knew I wanted to understand what does that mean? What do you have to care about and understand from a financial modeling standpoint and from a Wall Street finance
Right.
standpoint? And then I
Right.
said, okay, complete opposite. So many things die in that Series B, Series C stage. What
Mm.
does it take to get through that fundraising? What does it take to grow that business and actually find product market fit?
Wow.
And so the yes was a fashion focused technology startup.
Mm.
Um, and at the yes, one of the things that really attracted me to it as a startup was that its management was really experienced. So the founder, Julie Bornstein, had been a COO of Stitch Fix and had started Sephora's online business and Nordstrom's online business. And so I felt like even if ultimately the startup itself, like, failed or prospered, I would be learning from people who were really experienced in the industry and also were taking like this really big chance.
Wow.
And I'd be learning how a business actually grows and all of these like nitty gritty, messy things and infrastructure you have to build in a startup. Um, so those are some of the things I wanted to get out of it. The experience brought me some of that and brought me like a lot of learning in terms of being in the room with senior leaders. But we also ended up selling to Pinterest, which means I was essentially an in-house banker for like whatever 4 or 5 months. And so it was again kind of an intense role, but a really unique one and like a great resume builder. And so as we come to Pinterest and the opportunity I might have had in terms of ownership of like business units has shifted because we're at such a larger organization with more bureaucracy and hierarchy.
Right.
Now my potential, what I want to learn from it has changed. It's like, okay, what I want to learn from a mid to large size public tech company.
Mm.
Do I think Pinterest is the right place to learn it? Do I feel like I have a good leadership set of leadership around me? And do I feel like there is a somewhat clear path to job stability and promotion? So
Wow.
those are all questions that I'm like figuring out now in our first 6 months there.
Amazing. Oh my gosh. I know we're kind of hitting time, but I have two questions that I'd love to ask you if you have the space for it. Awesome. First one, just to take a step back, I guess. I think it'd be really cool for the students to get your intake on this. What do you see as the future of retail shopping? And what role does marketing play in that?
Very interesting question because this is all I've thought about for the last 9 months. I think it's going to be truly omni-channel. I do not think that retail, brick and mortar retail is ever going to be dead. I think that like coming through the pandemic and on somewhat of the other end of it, you can see that, right? Like there was all this, it's the retail apocalypse and like stores aren't going to exist anymore, blah, blah, blah. And that's not true. Like we've maybe accelerated consumer behavior to understand online shopping and shift consumers there. But I think people are still going to want to have tangible experiences with goods, and personal narratives connected to those goods. There is, I think, still such white space in terms of how what the consumer funnel looks like in terms of leveraging the internet. Like I think that there's such a breadth of stuff out there, and there's still so much opportunity to personalize what people are getting in the same way we have with music with Spotify or like dating. Like there's so many ways to have access to things that align with your values and the way you want to represent yourself. So I think that
Mm,
that is one of the big tech gaps that we don't yet have, that the yes is trying to do for fashion and someone will try to do for everything else,
wow.
is that big marketplace for consumer goods. And marketing is like huge in that. I mean, it's like the main thing, right? And I think you have two folds. There's marketing in terms of brand marketing and developing your brand story and brand value positioning to customers. And then there's performance marketing, which is super data driven, and growth marketing and understanding like return on ad spend and all these tech platforms you can leverage to do it. But there's so many strategies in terms of like developing that product market fit and how to speak to your consumer. And it's going to be incredibly crucial the more choice people have and the less direction people have in narrowing that choice.
Wow. So it's kind of about, and it seems like both of the things you said are connected in that sense of like the marketing's going to be that, like the bridge to getting people to the personalized goods, products, whatever. Of course, they need to be created, but the way they get connected to it is the role marketing's going to play there, to the brand or narrative that makes sense. Awesome. I think we have one question from Jess, and then maybe we can wrap things up. The question is, how do you find that balance between the mentality that says hustle, work hard, and give up work-life balance while you're, or and give up work-life balance while you're young and taking care of your overall health, mentally, emotionally, and physically?
This is a hard one and deeply personal. Um, I th- I think maintaining as many channels to yourself as possible is important. And so like even if you're in a highly stressful time, developing some sort of a way of checking in with yourself. And sometimes that doesn't look prescriptive. Like sometimes that is purely your intuition saying, can't do this right now, need XYZ right now. Like, and sometimes it can be structured. Like if you're super, super busy, as I was in some of my first years out of grad, I didn't really have time to put concerted effort toward thinking about how to take care of myself. And I lost a lot of myself in that process until there were like red flags going on and alarms in my head saying, you need something else filling you right now. You need to go on a walk. You need to like sit in silence for 10 minutes. Like it became things that were more pressing and intuitive to my body. Um, but in terms of like managing it in general and then how you approach the like society's approach to work hard, I do think it's a deeply personal decision around when knowing the compromise you're making, knowing when you want to make it and when you think it's worth it and when it's not. Like understanding that there might be times that you're going to compromise life or things that are going to sustain your physical and mental health for work. What's the output of that? And do you value that enough to make that compromise in the moment? And do you have the right um, methods in place to then counteract that and bring yourself healing and figure out how to get in touch with yourself later? Um, yeah, I don't know. The answer is kind of all over the place, but I think it's a continual learning process of figuring out what feeds you and making sure to make time for it and understanding that there will sometimes be compromises and weighing those for yourself.
Absolutely. I'm writing this down. I was like, wow, knowing like the channels to yourself, like holy fuck, like what a beautiful way to think about it. Gosh, well, I know we're at time, so Chandra, thank you so much for
Yeah.
spreading so much insight, wisdom, knowledge into retail, yourself, your path, your journey. I think the students are gonna have a lot of meaning out of it. And where can students find you if they want to follow you or stay connected?
Yeah. On LinkedIn, which I will admit I am on very little, but it's Chandra, Sahu, Sahu, the one who's at Pinterest currently, and a woman. And then feel free to follow me on Instagram. I'm like personally active there. And sometimes I'm more responsive to professional questions there as well. So that is Chan Sahu, Chansahu. And then email, you can email me first.last at outforundergrad.org or csahu@pinterest.com.
Awesome, amazing. Thank you so much for your time today, and
Yeah.
always a pleasure to getting to chat with you and see you.
Yeah. Best of luck with the conference and students on your journey.
Awesome, thank you. Have a good evening.